Counter-Narrative News brings you a report on the ongoing continuities of British colonial divide and rule as it pertains particularly to the partition of the Indian subcontinent and how they're playing themselves out in working class communities in Leicester, on the one hand Muslim, on the other hand Hindu. This was published last year in a quite well-known prestigious progressive magazine in India called The Caravan. So to start, though the city of Leicester has had a recent history of ethnic animosity, the ferocity with which it descended into a maelstrom of communal violence in September caught the police, the press and local community leaders off guard. It started with a brief clash between cricket fans after a match on the 28th of August, which many could write off though as a common enough occurrence, but a sense of unease remained for the next few weeks, with The Guardian reporting seven communal disturbances in East Leicester. That was the change on 17th of September when a mob of 300 Hindu men in face marks and balaclavas, many of them armed, marched through the Muslim-majority Green Lane Road chanting Jai Shri Ram and Vande Mataram, which are basically bigoted slogans of the white supremacist movement of the BJP and RSS, which are far-right movements that use and abuse the religion of Hinduism. It was a sight immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with modern India. The tiny detachment of police on the scene would be unable to prevent the violence that was about to take place. The mob then marched to Melton Road, where a similar number of South Asian Muslim youth had followed in response. After a senseless melee involving broken bottles, enough police finally arrived to divide the two groups. That's not to say that the police are the answer in these situations, they're not, but it's just to kind of report on the facts and its impact. 3 days later, these tensions spilled over into Smethwick area of Birmingham. Smethwick area, the famous area that Malcolm X made famous in a sense, or perhaps his presence there made the place even more famous considering the notoriety of the racism of the landlords and the political class of both Tories and Labour at that time. And we'd reference people to go to other videos of ours on that particular instance of Malcolm X's visit to Smethwick. But 3 days later, after these tensions in Leicester, they spill over in Smethwick area of Birmingham, with some 200 masked Muslim men confronting Hindus at the Durga Bhavan temple. Rumours had abounded that Nisha Ratambara, the founder of the militant Hindu group Durga Vahini, was going to speak at the temple. The organisers cancelled Ratambara's tour, citing her poor health, but the communal clashes were making headlines across the world by then, and there were calls for the cancellation of at least one event in her ongoing speaking tour in the United States. After a week of skirmishes and vandalism, the police made 55 arrests. Much of the reporting about communal tensions in Leicester tends to assume that religious divisions are natural aspects of South Asian communities in Britain. The histories of these communities could not be more different. Even though the South Asian diaspora arrived in Leicester in the shadow of the brutal fratricide of partition, these communities shared a deep cross-religious, cross-continental unity, particularly when resisting the common experiences of racism and poverty. But as poverty and racism rise in post-Brexit Britain, the latest incidents show the different paths South Asians have come to take in order to confront economic and cultural stagnation. The mobs at Leicester were the result of decades of British government policy and mobilisation of the Hindu right, which has slowly unwound a community that did not previously define itself along religious lines. But it's also a result of the British government's policy of manipulating the Muslim world, particularly in the British states, close alliance with the most toxic white supremacist client states and colonial client states of the British, not least the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The story of South Asian diaspora's presence in Leicester starts with the British National Act of 1948, which technically gave those in the Commonwealth the right to settle and work in Britain. The British government brought over workers from the Caribbean, Pakistan and India and helped to rebuild the economy after the destruction of the Second World War. People from India and Pakistan moved into Spinney Hill and Belgrave areas of Leicester, where affordable private housing was available. They included Punjabis from Jalandhar, Hoshiarpur, some of whom were former members of the armed forces during the war, the armed forces of the British, that is, and of course we had Indian armed forces of the liberation movements too. The optimism South Asian immigrants had for a comfortable future bound by newly created Commonwealth and shared suffering during the Second World War quickly dissipated on their arrival. Migrants from the former colonies suffered racism on nearly every level of society, including exclusion from sports and the prevalent cultural life. As a necessity, they started to self-organize. The Indian community in Leicester established its own film society in 1955. An African Caribbean cricket team was started in 1948, which became the West Indian Sports and Social Club by 1957. And histories that require its own kind of record and research and popularization. Beautiful histories. Religious organizing soon followed. Leicester's first mosque opened in 1962, its first Gurdwara for Sikhs in 1963, and a Hindu temple or mandir in 1969. Despite their cultural differences, South Asian and African Caribbean migrants faced similar experiences of colonialism and racism in Britain. This often led to joint struggles for self-defense and survival. Such united struggles of former colonized peoples in England was constantly resisted by the British government. This is most visible in the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962, which specifically aimed at the limiting of the flow of migration from the Caribbean and South Asia, something that Claudia Jones, a prolific, wonderful leader of our grassroots, campaigned against with many others at the time, including Roy Saw and all the Black Power, Black grassroots at that time from Asia, Africa and the Caribbean. Such animosity often only tied these communities closer together. Claudia Jones, a well-known grassroots organizer, as we said, in Caribbean and Asian communities, campaigned with the Punjabi communist activist Abhimanyu Manchanda against the 1962 Act, arguing its main aim is to cut coloured immigration, and in doing so it would proclaim before the world that this is not to be a multi-racial commonwealth, but one in which the majority will be the second-class citizen. Thus argued Claudia Jones. She argued that the law created divisions between white and coloured workers and people, providing the green light to racialism, to racial prejudice in theory and practice. End of quote. The relationship between Jones and Manchanda also reflected how diasporic unity was tied together by their strong radical Marxist or black Marxist perhaps leanings, with the rights of working class people of colour being the plank on which economic and racial exploitation could be challenged. The British government responded by establishing a quota-type handout to communities defined on religious sectarian grounds. British policy used to divide opposition in the colonies was now brought home against the coloured working class of Leicester, Birmingham and Blackburn, or as some other people called the internal colonies within the colonial centre. Attempts at such a division grew further following the Ugandan dictator Idi Amin's policy of expelling South Asians en masse. In the decades following 1968, no city in Britain received as many displaced Asians from East Africa as Leicester. Belgrave, Melton Road and Rushmede, areas which experienced the most recent burst of communal violence, were largely settled by East African Asians around this time. There were only 638 South Asians in the city in 1951, but by 1981 it had over 6,000 people from the Commonwealth. A majority of them were factory workers. The Leicester-based factory of the Imperial Typewriters Company, for example, employed 1,600 staff in 1974, of which 1,100 were South Asians, mostly female migrants from East Africa. Asian workers found out that they were being paid considerably less than their white counterparts in the white-owned factory, and in May 1974 went on strike. The picket lines were attacked by racists and many strikers were arrested, but the strike eventually succeeded. The stories of such united action against racism and economic exploitation are entirely missing from history curricula and been largely begun to die out, even in oral forms of community memory in the region. The legacy of the strike Imperial Typewriters, like that of the historic 2-year Gromwick strike in London, led by the East African Asian worker Jaivan Desai, does not inform the consciousness and imagination of South Asian working class, especially the youth in Leicester, anymore. And that is the challenge, to re-inculcate the newer generations into that. The erasure of this history is not accidental. It was a process that began with the crushing of trade unions by Margaret Thatcher in the 80s. The social and cultural organizations within unions that brought together Hindu, Muslim and Sikh youth from South Asia also withered away. With the class-based solidarity weakening, the British government also officiated ethnic differences. In 1991, for the first time, the UK census asked a question about ethnicity, obliging respondents to identify themselves as Asian Indian, Asian Pakistani, Asian Bangladeshi or Asian Other. There was no category for East Asian Africans. Leicester was recorded as having 60,000 Indians, nearly 4,000 Pakistanis and and 1,000 Bangladeshis over 2,000 Asian others, quote-unquote. This hatchet to South Asian identity was only strengthened by the next census in 2001. Respondents were asked to identify themselves by religion. By 2011, the population of Muslims, including both South Asians and others, had overtaken the Hindu population, making them the largest non-Christian group in Leicester. While advocates of the policy sell it as an attempt by the government to address systemic racism, it often has the same effect as the British colonial approach of institutionalising division in the name of inclusion and diversity, and there's the British trick. There is often little explanation to the arbitrariness of the sudden changes. The 2021 census, for example, added the Roma people, a migrant community, many of whom trace their ancestry to South Asia, that also faced racial persecution in Europe for centuries, but they categorise in the census, that's the Roma, in the white category. The 2021 census also fails to have categories for Asian Caribbean people. It's absolutely crazy. But there's a design to that, of course. Census categorization itself is far removed from everyday life. However, when coupled with a decades-old policy of local and national governments dishing out funds based on quotas, along ethnic and religious lines that is, it has for these categories, it had the potential to lead to the very real forms of community divisions. While all Asian working class communities face similar problems of growing poverty, diminished services, people have tended to go where the state has herded them, into sectarian communities and politics. Political parties also tend to perpetuate these divisions by attempting to garner votes through community gatekeepers who represent the different religious groupings in the city. As of 2014, Leicester was one of the most religious areas in Britain, with almost a quarter of its residents taking part in religious life. The effects of these policies have been visible since the early 90s. In July 1992, Indians and Pakistanis clashed in Blackburn. The police eventually arrested 39 youths and confiscated some 50 petrol bombs. A year later, Birmingham, Coventry and Derby saw similar communal attacks with firebombs hurled at Hindu temples. In 1995, colleges in Southall and Hounslow in West London were scarred by frequent clashes between Sikh and Muslim right-wing groups. Where has this left the people of Leicester? Both Hindu and Muslim areas in the city are subject to the same impoverishment and neglect that is being seen across working class communities in the country. Before the pandemic, it was estimated that 40% of all children in the city, around 30,000 of them, were living in poverty. According to the Office for National Statistics, Leicester has the lowest household disposable income in the United Kingdom. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Leicester became the city most notorious for big surges in case numbers linked to what is dubbed as the super exploitation of garment factory workers, most of whom are South Asian women who arrived recently in the country. Studies show that the workers in Leicester's factories are paid as little as £3 an hour, although reporting suggests this can go even lower, despite the minimum wage in Britain for those aged 25 and over being £8.72 an hour, which is still a very derisory sum. The key difference between the exploitation experienced by factory workers in Leicester in the 70s and the present is that many employees are now themselves of South Asian descent. This is the class stratification that has grown over the decades. For these youth in Leicester, seeing oneself as a Hindu or Muslim impairs their ability to recognise those who continue to impoverish their communities. Even as workers in the region get a mere £3 an hour, the East African Asian executive chairman of Boohoo Group, an online fashion retailer that gets most of its finished textile pieces from factories around Leicester, gave himself a £150 million bonus in 2020. That's the year of the first year of the pandemic. The figures would be similar for other South Asians who own various parts of the garment supply chain in the city. These trends are likely only going to be further amplified by the rise of Hindutva, that is the internalized white supremacy in the use and abuse of Hinduism in parts of in India, and sectarian extremism also promoted by Western neocolonialism in parts of the Muslim world. Funding for youth services has been dramatically slashed in Leicester. Talking to one man today in Leicester, he said when he was younger, the Leicester Youth Association put on events, a secular, non-religiously demarcated organisation that has for nearly a decade ceased to exist. So slashes to youth service in Leicester, stopping access to cultural and sporting activities that could unify people and the youth. Boredom and the frustrations of grinding poverty are making religious extremism attractive to some young men. This was most graphically visible in the hundreds of young Muslim men who left Britain, well, thousands actually, who left Britain to join sectarian death squads, proxy death squads of neo-colonialism in Syria and Libya, in Iraq and further afield during the Arab Spring, or some may call it the NATO Arab Sting. Hindu youth do not have to go more than a few streets to join their own violent mobs. The British chapter of the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, the international wing of Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, the world's largest paramilitary force, was founded in 1966. It has consistently grown since then, now boasting 100 shakas, branches, and 2,000 weekly attendees. Having been registered as a charity in 1974, it receives government funding, despite the Charity Commission of England and Wales conducting an inquiry into whether the organisation was promoting, quote, views which are harmful to social cohesion, such as denigrating those of a particular faith or promoting segregation on religious or racial grounds, end of quote. Hindutva groups have also begun working alongside Britain's growing white nationalist movement and white supremacist far-right movements. One of Britain's most infamous far-right campaigners is a repeat convict known as Tommy Robinson. His real name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, who used to head the English Defence League, who conducted countless assaults themselves directly against mostly Muslim women and young girls, and also inspired countless other similar racist attacks. While his approach is very reminiscent of the old National Front type of street provocateurs of the neo-Nazi movement, he and others like him frequently try to build a global alliance of Islamophobic populist figures celebrating the likes of Donald Trump, Netanyahu and Narendra Modi. Since 2009, the EDL has mobilized anti-Muslim groups in the Hindu community. Yaxley Lennon teamed up with the former RSS leader Tapan Ghosh as a way of influencing Hindus to join his agenda. He also attempted to capitalize on the Leicester violence by releasing videos on social media asking his far-right audience to stand with Hindus. The speed and comfort with which Hindu youth make bedfellows, well, the internalized white supremacist Hindu youth, and all of them make bedfellows of white nationalists, make it tough to believe that just a few decades ago, Muslim and Hindu youth and workers fought together on the picket lines against racist street attacks and in other situations. Neither the extremism of Hindu nationalist organizations nor their proximity to white nationalist organizations has limited the support they get from Britain's largest political parties. Several Conservative members of Parliament openly aligned with the Hindutva forces in Britain, with the former Prime Minister David Cameron ending in 2013 a decade-long diplomatic freeze with Modi due to the latter's involvement in the Gujarat pogroms against Muslims. During the British general election in 2019, forces close to Modi's BJP sought to influence the election in favour of the Tories, sending WhatsApp messages to British Hindus that accused the Labour Party of being anti-India, anti-Hindu and anti-Modi, so-called. One such message was called Labour, the mouthpiece of the Pakistani government, and said that Indian supporters of the party were traitors to their ancestral land, to their family and friends in India and to their cultural heritage. This is not too surprising, given that the Conservatives' political discourse is not too dissimilar to that of the BJP. It's both forms of white supremacy. However, cozying up to Hindutva happens on both sides of the aisle. The Labour MP Barry Gardiner, a former member of the shadow cabinet, has a seemingly special relationship with Modi and the BJP, glossing over the deeply problematic sectarian politics of the BJP government. Besides congratulating BJP on his re-election, Gardiner refused to support the Indian farmers protesting the Modi government's neoliberal reforms, expressing his broad support for its economic agenda. This is not just a disservice to Labour's history, well, its purported history, which is of apparently standing up against the far right, but runs contrary to the very economic ideology that founded the party. But let's remember, back in Smethwick in the early to mid-40s, Labour basically adopted the same racist platform as the Tories in that toxically racist situation where Malcolm X intervened. Following the violence in Leicester, the Labour Party leader Keir Starmer said that Hinduphobia has absolutely no place in our society. Anywhere we must fight it all together. End of quote. Hinduphobia is a concept framed by the right wing to claim a manipulative victimhood when they themselves are often agents of sectarian provocation, not too dissimilar to the white supremacy in the form of the Israeli settler colonial state community. It is true that Hindus in Britain are subject to racist abuse and attacks, absolutely, as all racialized people are. However, the concept of Hinduphobia, in the way Hindutva forces frame it, distorts the actual power relations at play in complex situations such as in Leicester. With the economic, social and political influences pulling South Asian youth in Britain further down the pipeline of sectarian division, now is as good time as ever to understand how these communities came together in the 60s and 70s to better the prospects in an openly racist state. The economic similarities between those times and now are not lost on at least parts of the political leadership. Claudia Webb, the independent MP, former Labour for Leicester East, recently wrote an open letter to the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman, the current Home Secretary Suella Braverman, an East African Asian woman who has been a vocal opponent of immigration adopting totally neo-Nazi and far-right concepts and centre-grounding them. And Claudia Webb writes to her outlining the issues in her constituency. Quote, Leicester East is one of the most poverty-stricken areas of the country, Webb wrote. Both child poverty and in-work poverty are very high. End of quote. The high levels of inequality and lack of employment prospects, she added, quote, impacts, for example, the opportunities available to disaffected young men. The organisations to help build resilience have long disappeared with austerity, end of quote. The effects of this were also clear from her letter. Quote, thuggery, political right-wing nationalism from abroad, far-right fascism and racism are key features of the disorder, she wrote. In the aftermath, whilst walking through the back streets in the vicinity of where the violence occurred, I witnessed discarded balaclavas and surgical blue gloves, with the police also retrieving weapons. Too many residents have told me they are living in fear, with many feeling too frightened to leave their homes, end of quote. Her words sound eerily similar to the first-person accounts written at the time of partition. The awkward and violent borders that are now drawn mid-street in many British cities have both imperial policy and extremists in their own community to blame. The generation of South Asians that came to Britain fleeing partition and living their lives in its shadow was still able to look past deep-seated hatreds when faced with terrifying economic hardships. It will take a lot of strength for the youth on the streets of Leicester today to follow in their footsteps, but that is the challenge going forward, and we encourage everyone and their friends and their networks to absolutely dedicate themselves to that, because it's about the future of our young people today and our smaller children the next day. Many thanks.